I'm Rachel Aziz Wilson, and I'm from the East Coast, Century Point. And my ancestor in the Afghan descendants is Sultan Aziz, and he was, as far as I know, the last Afghan to cart goods across Australia with camels. And don't really know much else from that. I know, from what I know, he had one son, and his son was named Sultan, who then enlisted in the army at 18, came back probably around early 20s, I'm just guessing by the paperwork that I've got, and then struggled mentally and decided to end his life at around 28. So my dad grew up not knowing who his family really was. He grew up without a male role model, and he just spent the rest of his life searching in between, trying to figure out who he was, making mistakes and all the rest of it. And I think it was around 1980 something, he decided to really get into looking to where he was from. I remember growing up as a kid, sort of asking me, are we Aboriginal, are we Afghan? And he said, oh, I don't know, kiddo, we'll look into it, we'll figure it out. And then more of the Afghan side came out, more information. I've got a lot of letters that he'd write to people, you know, trying to figure out who he was from. He even wrote to the army once he figured out his dad was in the army and got some information about that. But I think it was around the 1986 or something, he decided to do a camel trek. And I don't have all the details on it, but I do have a lot of memories on it. And his main object was to find out more about the Afghan history and figure out who he was, and just, you know, embrace the culture. I think once he started delving into where he was from and what his heritage was, his mind was blown, and he had no other choice but to keep going and keep looking, especially when it meant so much to him, because he spent a lot of time on the highways and in the outback and things like that. And I remember him saying he could feel the presence of him, and I was young, I was like, oh, whatever. But then he got right into it. I was about 8 when he started 7 or 8 when he started the camel trek. And I just remember it was all his time. It was everything. Before he started the camel trek, he had a really bad truck accident, which was close to sort of ending his life. And I think after that, he couldn't work. He had a lot of free time, and he needed to soul search. And that's where it all began. That's when he started finding out about the ancestors, and then it was all clicking to him about his childhood and why he spent so much time in the outback and having the feelings that he did. And then that's when we had the camel trek. And it just, I think, took up a good couple of years of his life, and that was sort of vague memories that I have of it, but I do know that it was something that he was figuring out as he was going along, and he used a lot of his time and money that he got from his truck accident to get all this going. I think he just wanted to keep he calls it the Gan spirit alive. Right, well, I don't know exactly where he ended. There is some information that I'm going to get after this of exactly the map. But it did start, from my knowledge, I've got a photo here of the camels. They've come from Gordon Hample, and they were obviously brought to Century Point. And we started at Century Point, and we went in. I don't know exactly how the program went, but I do remember having all these camels at the local shops and lots of people coming around. We walked the camels from Sanctuary Point to Nowra McDonald's on the highway, and McDonald's had a bit of a thing to do where they brought out all the staff to give all the people that were part of the camel trek, you know, burgers and whatnot, and then it just went from there. He was raising money for Camp Quality and the Crippled Children's Association, I think it was called at the time. And there was lots of events that happened, you know, with the Camp Quality and, you know, things that we went to where they had their a horse riding station that Camp Quality funded for the kids with the cancer that could come and just enjoy some time. And we had a big thing there with the camels and having all the kids together and doing the horse rides. And I think he went from, that's a photo of his camels at the pub on the highway just before the McDonald's in Narra. So that was probably a good 25 Ks, maybe 20 Ks I'd already done from Century Point to get to this destination. This is now a big facility on the highway. And I think he went, I don't know if he went straight from there and went to Broken Hill and the exact route, but I do know that he went from town to town and donated bricks to each town that wanted to contribute. And it was around the bicentennial year. So I think this was after the camel trek. Once he went and did the camel trek, raised the money, got the satisfaction that he needed out of it, because I feel like it was more for him that he was doing this for. Of course, he wanted everyone to know about it because he was so proud and whatnot. And after that, he realised that the Muslim religion was, you know, a big part of their thing. So we ended up doing he ended up getting involved a lot with some really in-depth, is the right word, Muslims. We were like invited to mosques and we'd go and pray. Learnt the alphabet, and I was only young, so I used to get really upset because I wasn't allowed to walk into I would be a little kid at a stranger's house and I'd be told I have to go through the front door and we'll take you from here and your dad will go through the back door. So dad will go to the back door and pray and whatnot, and I got to sit around with all the women and help prepare food and think what's going on. But I would learn a lot of the prayers that you'd say when you were washing your hands. Praying was something that he was getting right into, right? Even if we were travelling, he'd pull over and he'd get the mat out. And me being from my mum's English, and I was brought up as a Catholic, so when he was going through that stage, I was like interested but also frightened at the same time. But I took it on, and I can still remember the prayers, and I spin my kids out actually. I go, and they go, what? Because they don't know a lot about it either, and I can't tell them. So what prayer I remember was, I think it was when you wash your hands, you're blessing the water, because you want, just like all religions have their Baptist water or whatever, and this was just something that they did. I hope it's right. Auzubillah minash shaitani rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. And that was one thing that I remember having to remember to say when you wash your hands and things like that. But being young, and so it was well after the camel trek, because I was on the verge of teenagehood. And he did say to me once, you know, there's so much we can learn from this, and, you know, we've got families in other countries. How would you feel about going to Iran? And I just went, whoa, that sounds really cool. I'll have to ask Mum, and Mum just shut me down. She just said no. And I was like, why? What's, you know, you don't want, I was rebelling. You don't want me to have this life. You don't want me to have culture. And she just said, Rachel, I don't want to, all I'm saying is, and this is the worst thing, her natural reaction without trying to put Dad down or anything. She said, I just want you to go and watch the movie, not without my daughter. And I did. And that was her. She was saying, no, you're not going to go because you're never going to come back. And her perception was it was all bad. It was all scary. And then, I don't know, there was a lot of mixed emotions about the Muslims and things like that, whereas I had lots of friends. I was like, oh, Fatima, she's really cool, and we get to go to all these places, and I knew so many people. So once my mum sort of said that, my whole perception changed, and it was like, well, hang on, I'm playing with some serious things here, only being young. And then it was sort of like, well, we were Afghabo, you know, so there was no who we really are. So I think the name calling of not knowing who we are, and we're Afghan, we're Abo, well, you're just going to be an Afghabo, and the fact that, oh my God, well, if you're Afghan, then you're part of some really scary, well, you don't want nothing to do with that. And I remember my dad used to say Aziz is a very powerful name. Like, and I used to get a lot of flack on it. You know, I even remember travelling. I'd be the first one to be like, let's look through your bags. So I know it sounds horrible, but when I got married and changed to Wilson, all that stopped. All the harassment of my last name stopped. But it was just really sad that that's what, people thought. And I think if I hadn't have listened to that, I could have taken him further with it. Because I think he needed me to keep going. And it was like when I left and said no, no one else was interested. So, years later, once he found himself and he was content where his life was at, which was driving trucks, even at 70, he got really sick and he just wanted to go back to his roots. And his main thing was, I've got to get back to Broken Hill. And his wish was to be put next to his father and buried on the top of his grandfather. His grandfather, Sultan Aziz, was buried in the Muslim way with the clothing and the timber slats and things like that. And it meant a lot to him, and he was pretty honoured to think that he could go in there on top of his grandfather next to his dad. So he was put on top of his grandfather, and for me the most amazing thing is that to go to that cemetery 3 years ago, you would not know who's there. It was dirt, it was all... Sultan was there with his headstone and whatnot because he was in the army, so that was part of the, obviously, army's responsibility to give them a headstone, but there was nothing for Sultan. So I remember Dad taking me there and showing me, this is where it is, because he knew he was going to pass. So we took a trip up there and he said, this is where he is, because it was just dirt. There was no headstone, no nothing. And he said, so what you need to do is we need to get a hold of the council. We actually had to make sure that it was in that right spot. And because if you go out there today, there's still a lot of graves there that have no name. You would think that it's just vacant land, but it's actually, people are buried there. No one has a clue who, where. So this was the same situation with Abdul. So when he passed, that's what we did. And so he went out there. I think it was just for him closure. It was so that he could spend his afterlife, as he would say, gaining more knowledge. He thought and he said, I know, he's up there with them, drilling them for information. He's yakking with his dad, saying what happened here and what happened there, because he grew up with none of them. He didn't have a role model. So it was good to know that I could do that and put him out there where he was born and bred, where all his memories were created and where his family is. And hopefully, over the years, people can put a bit more... I didn't bring it. Or do I have it? Put a bit more effort into their family that get buried out there. So I've now, since he's passed, gotten a headstone for him and his grandfather, because there was none. So they're combined, and we've put a camel on top so that they can be recognised. Big brass one, erudite in there so no one can take it. But he's also got his truck, which was the truck to him as he got older was his camel, because that's what he could control. And his business was called Gan Trans. There's a photo of that there somewhere too. And on the top of the truck, there's a visor that comes down and it says, "Easy does it." Oh no, I'm just having a mental blank. Spirit of the Gan was his logo on the visor of the truck. So we've now taken that and we've got that wired to the fence of the Mohammedan section in the Broken Hill Cemetery. So I'm hoping that it'll just get bigger and brighter, because 3 years ago it was just just piles of dirt and there's information for no one, nothing. So now we've got a nice big headstone. It's not big, a nice headstone for Sultan and Dad, Don Aziz, and we also put one on for Thora Aziz and her son, which are together. My kids, my son especially, Thor, who I didn't name on purpose after his grandmother, and he was also born on the same day as his grandfather, which was Sultan Aziz, which we didn't know existed until Dad said, "Oh yeah, made sure you brought your family into it because you called him after your grandmother and you named him after you. He was born on his grandfather's birthday." And so my son now has all these questions I can't answer. He's 18 and he's got the tattoo of the camels and the clouds and the year of Pop's birth, but I've got nothing else for him. So he's lost too. Well, he's sort of thinking the same thing. Like he said to me, "Am I Afghan or am I Aboriginal, Mum?" Like, and I said, "I think you're probably a bit of both." And he's scared of like, "Well, I don't want to be saying I'm Aboriginal when I'm not." Whereas I was like, I don't want to be associated with being an Afghan because we're criminals or we're bad people. So I just it would be good to be able to give him a bit of info too, considering I think he's reincarnated Sultan Aziz. I think that's it. But I think it was your book. I remember reading your book. I think it was your book. And they were saying that back in the 1800s, when the camel men had their camps and things like that, the Aboriginals were forced to work for the British, but they would run away and sneakily disappear and go and work for the Afghans for less pay, but were better treated. So back in those days, they became family. And I mean, if there's songs about it, not so, like the Drover's Boy and all that kind of stuff, my perspective is the Aboriginals and the Afghans were a family and they were all one. They weren't Afghans and they weren't Aboriginals because they were just family. And I think I'm assuming if it was 1800s, the Aboriginals weren't going to stand up and go, "Oh yeah, I'm an Aboriginal." It's the last thing they were going to do. They would say, "Well, I'm one of these guys," because they're not going to get... Yeah, it's just another question I wanted to know, because I was thinking I was bringing my kids up to say they were one thing and they weren't. But after all of this, I'm quite happy to say we're Afgabo. It is what it is. And I think there is probably a scarce culture out there of Afghan Aboriginals that no one knows about. Had the knowledge of it. These guys, we had the Afghans that had the equipment and the things that they needed, but they also needed the knowledge from the Aboriginals on where's your land, how does it work, and they realised if we do it together, we can do great things.